Are we live? Can everybody hear me? It's good to see y'all tonight. It's good to be with you. I hope y'all already figured out I'm not Chad, I guess. Okay. Yeah, I've got more hair than Chad. That's not a joke. That's not funny. If you had to guess how many decisions you made today, how many decisions you think you made today? One?
I got up.
That's a good decision to make, too. I asked Jan, he said, how long after I wake up do I run on autopilot before I have to really decide something? I figure it's about 7:30. I go to work about 7, and it about takes me, and I get up at 6. So it's a long time before I actually have to decide anything. All of us every day, though, make probably hundreds of decisions, choices, directions that we have to have. And sometimes those get us in trouble, and sometimes they don't. And I took a class when I was at West Georgia. It was called, I believe, Critical Decision Making. And the professor came out, and he had this big spreadsheet, and he rolls it out, and it has pros and cons. And he says, this is one way to make a decision. You take everything, every bit of knowledge, and you put it pro or con, and you write it down. And the list that's the longest is the one you go with. He said, that's not a very good way to do it, but that is a way to do it. Then he pulls a quarter out, and he said, this is another way to do it on the other end of the spectrum, just flip a quarter. Well, somewhere in between those is a correct way to make decisions, and the Bible talks a lot about that. In the Bible, it talks about two different courses, two different directions, and our decisions will make up the direction that we go in, left or right. And we're going to look at those two different courses, those two different directions. I heard a sermon by Gerald Noe. I don't remember where I heard it, but it had an excellent title, and I borrowed his title and some of his points for this lesson tonight. And his title was, Are You Pitching Tents? Are You Opening Windows? Pitching tents or opening windows. If you think you know what these two phrases come from, the stories, raise your hand if you know which these phrases come from. My fifth graders know it. Okay, Bob's got it. Bob, you're the it boy. Okay, we're going to look at these two different phrases tonight because they're heading in two different directions, two different courses. One's pitching tents and one is opening windows. Take your Bibles and turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 13. Chapter number 13. We'll start off by pitching some tents. I'll do a little prelude to chapter 13 and chapter 12. Now, y'all know this quite well, but I'll just give us some background before we get into the main part. It starts in chapter number 12, and God speaks to Abraham, and he says, get you out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, y'all remember this promise that God spoke to Abraham. Before this point, Abraham had lived up in the Ur of the Chaldees in the Haran area, way up in the northern part of northern where he's going to Canaan. Canaan's quite a bit south. And that's where he's at, and that's where God makes this promise to him. And you remember, we've had, I believe when Brother Ramsey was here, he talked in detail about the Ur of the Chaldees and what a developed place is where they had indoor plumbing, they had it made there, and it was a city dwelling. But now he's going to change the whole lifestyle from living in a city to being a nomad. And we'll see that as we move along. In verse 5 it says, Then Abraham took Sarah's wife and Lot, his brother's son. So that would make Lot his nephew. Now, Lot's dad had passed away by this time. He was dead, so Lot was Abraham's shadow. He went where Abraham went and watched Abraham. So that's important to remember as we go through this scenario. And he left Haran, and they go down to, first they get down to Bethel. And everywhere Abraham goes, something happens. Something is built. What is built in Bethel? Altar. And what do they do with this altar? Sacrifice. They worship God. It's worship. And then they leave Bethel as God directs them, and they go down to Ai. And what do they do in Ai? They're setting a precedent here. They built an altar and they worship. And then a famine came upon the land, a bad drought as we would probably call it. And it seems like every time God's people have a bad drought, they go to the same place. They go to Egypt. And Egypt's got the biggest river in the whole part of the world and, the lowest place. So that's a good place to go. They always got water in Egypt. So they go to Egypt, but in Egypt, something's different. Abram didn't build an altar here. He fabricated a lie. And y'all remember, he tells the Pharaoh that Sarah's his sister because she is so good looking. Because something had changed in the mind of Abraham. The war that Satan fights is not on a battleground, it's between our ears, and y'all understand that. And in some reason or another, I don't know, I wasn't with Abraham that day, but his faith is not as strong as probably it should have been or could have been or had been. And he tells this lie to the Pharaoh, and it seems to be working pretty good till God got involved. Up to this point, the Pharaoh thought a lot of Sarah, and Sarah's old now. This is, they're not young chickens here. But she impressed the Pharaoh and the people that saw her. And they tell the lie, and the Pharaoh blesses Abraham with all kind of things. Wealth, just a lot of wealth. Gold, servants, cattle, all kind of things. But God plagues the Pharaoh because this is wrong. Now, I have a hard time with this, and later on in the story there'll be another section that you'll probably have a hard time with too, but can you imagine giving your wife away? Now, some of y'all can do that, but I can't. Y'all know me. I don't know up from down. But Jan's, got my leash in her hand. And it's helpful that way, and it works that way, and God made it that way. But this is kind of hard to understand, and that's the choice that Abraham made. But that's not the choice we're looking at tonight. That's just a choice that was made. And when God begins to plague Pharaoh, Pharaoh figures it out, and Pharaoh asked Abraham in no uncertain terms to do what? What? Louder. Leave. Is that what y'all said? Leave. That's what he said. Get. And he did. And he went back the same way that he came from. He goes back through Ai, and there they worshiped God. It said he called on the name of the Lord, which usually means to worship. And that's what they did, and they went back through Bethel. And at some point, now we're down to about chapter number 13. And in chapter 13, verse 1, then Abraham went up from Egypt with his wife and Lot with him to the south, and Abraham was very, very, very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. And he went up from his journey from the south and far as Bethel, and the place where the tent had been in the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, and at the place of the altar, and there they were at first. And Abraham called on the name of the Lord, which is to worship. And Lot also, there's Lot again, who went with Abraham, had flocks, herds, and tents. I don't see any signs of gold and silver, but he had herds and tents and flocks. And now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, and their possessions was great, and they could not dwell together. Now think about that a minute. Now they're nomadic. They're not living in the city as they had earlier. And they've got so many cattle and so many goats, sheep, anything that walks on four legs, camels, whatever. And they've got so many they can't be together. Now they're up in a part of the country where it's kind of rolling hills, and the grass, if you know anything about cattle and sheep and horses and all, they all graze differently. And some of them take a lot more grass than others. And some of them doesn't take very much grass at all. So they just can't, the land won't support them all. They're eating it down to the dirt, and somebody hadn't got any food. And you can imagine, and what we'll read here is the herdsmen of Lot and of Abraham began to quarrel. It says there's strife between the herdsmen of Abraham and the herdsmen of Lot. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites also dwelt in the land. Now, Chad talked to that verse a week or two ago, if you remember when he talked about that verse. And why, you read that and you say, why is that important? Because there's somebody there watching. That's why that's important, and you're always an example. But there's this strife between the herdsmen. These are the people that work for these two wealthy men that take care to make sure these flocks are healthy and they're taken care of and watered well. Now, in knowing human, how we act sometimes, think about what would have happened if this had not been dealt with, these two groups of herdsmen had not been dealt with, rapidly. Think about that a minute. It's sort of like when you go to a ball game. There's some people in here that coach Little League or girls or something, and I've coached girls softball. And somebody hits the ball to the infield, and the first baseman's catching it, gets drawn across the first base bag, and the one running from home just knocks that first baseman out into right field about 20 feet. And she comes in after she gets her wits about her and starts talking down the end of the bench about how they had done that on purpose. And before it gets all the way back up to where the coach is sitting, it gets to the coach as if the coach had told her to do that. And then the coaches are nose to nose by, when the game's over. And that's the way we usually tend to things. We let it fester, and we let the anger grow, and we don't do anything about it. But Abraham was different. Read on down a little further. Let me find where I got to. And Abraham said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are brethren. Now stop right there just a second. He went directly to Lot, and he said, let there not be very much strife here. He said, let there be no strife. Zilch, not a bit. As Barney would say, let's nip this in the bud right now. And that's the way we have to be sometimes, because sometimes we have a tendency to put it off because we don't want to go stand to that person with our hat in our hand and say, we don't need to let this go anywhere. We need to tend to this right now. But Abraham in his wisdom, and that's why he's in charge, it is quite apparent that there be no strife, and for we are brethren. Now that term, we hear a lot of sermons and lessons on we are brethren. But I don't think sometimes we understand what that means or really take it home to what's being said there when Abraham says that. Now, Lot is a nephew of Abraham. He could have told Lot to get, and he would have had to do so. But he didn't say that. We are brethren. And I have a lot of people in my family. I have 3 sisters and a brother. And, we can fuss and cut up and slap and kick and do all those things. But at the end of the day, they're still my siblings. And you better leave them alone. And that's the way that we should be. We should be able to discuss things, fix things, and keep it within ourselves as brethren. But we don't see it that way sometimes. And sometimes you get brother so-and-so over here, and he don't like brother so-and-so over there. And they don't fix that for years and don't talk. And that's not right. So we learned something here from Abraham. When something occurs that would cause any strife, he said, let there be no strife. No, zilch, nada. Let's fix it. And that's one of the things we learn here. But their main point here, though, is Lot. And that's what we're going to look at, is Lot. Starting in verse number 9. In verse number 9 it says, is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, I will take the right. Or if you go to the right, I will go to the left. Now Abraham, the one that's in charge, the one that's the boss, the one that God has commissioned to go on this trip, he's came to Lot. Now I can identify with Lot right here because I've worked with my dad from the time that I remember. From probably 4 years old, I was a gopher. I was in his shadow. And I was one of those nutty kids that said, let me do it, let me do it, let me do it. And he never would let me do it until I got quite a bit older. But I can identify with Lot in the fact that he had watched Abraham for all this time. And finally, Abraham says, okay, you do it. You've got a choice. You've got a decision. Now, some of y'all probably grew up in the same situation. It may have been a boss, a supervisor, a parent. But you finally get the opportunity to make a choice. And you want to get it right. You want to get it right. And there's a lot of things going through your head. Part of it is how quickly can I make this decision to impress this person? That's one of them. It's not a good thing to be going through your mind. Y'all are probably the same thing I were. When our girls were coming up and they would take an exam, I said, your exams doesn't have anything to do with time. You be the last one to turn your exam in. Beth remembers me telling her, Caitlin too, be the last one. Make sure they're all right. You don't get a better grade by being first to turn it in. But anyway, I could just imagine all the things that's going through Lot's mind right now about trying to get this decision right. Now, we know the rest of the story. He didn't. Let's read on down a little further and we'll learn a little bit more to this process. Starting in verse number 10, and Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. Now right here we see a mindset in Lot that he had a strong attraction to the world. Think about that. A strong attraction to this world. He saw that all the plain of Jordan was well watered everywhere. Now I can identify with that choice because what was he trying to accomplish with the choice that he was given? He's trying to do what? Watering grass for sheep. Yep. That's what he's trying to accomplish. There it is right there. All that Jordan Valley. It's green. It's wet. Perfect. Got it. Good decision. Good decision. He thinks it's a good decision. But if he was making it on economics, if he'd just finished, economics 101, that would have been A+. Got it right. Boom. He's done. But that wasn't all there was to it. That's not all there is to it. What else could he have done to help make that decision a more sound decision? What could he have done? Turn over to the book of Proverbs, chapter 11, verse 14. Somebody want to read that?
The law of the wise is
Wait a minute. 11:14 Proverbs.
For the soul is no counsel when people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety.
Exactly. How much counsel did Lot choose to accept in this decision? Okay, he didn't have any counsel. Nobody told him anything. Now, I came up with 4 different people that I thought might have been good for him to use for counsel. Somebody tell me somebody that he might have confided in to ask, what do you think? Abraham, 1. Did you say?
Abraham.
Who else? God, 2. The herdsman. Y'all forgot probably the second most important one. Miss Lot, that's right. You better get that one right. Miss Lot. But I thought about that. But all of them could have given a little bit more information to this equation he's trying to figure out. But, Lot was young. He was trying to make an impression on Abraham, I'm sure, because I would have been trying to do the same thing. And I can see myself. But these 4 could have given him some information. I was thinking about these 4 different people. There was no altar built. We don't see any altar being built, no prayers offered. Because God had some information about that part of the land that I don't think Lot had, or Lot chose not to use in the equation at this point. And Abraham would have probably said, that's a great decision. That's a great choice. But he might have just put his hand right up under his chin and asked him, what's out there on the horizon? What are those? And he would have said, well, that's the cities of the plain. And he might have asked him, do you know anything about that? And then there's his herdsman. His herdsman may have known something. They may have come and said, do you know, the cattle down in there, they had blackleg last year, and, we could get sick cows if we take them down there, or they could have had hoof and mouth or some other disease that could have wiped them out. They may have known some things, or they may have said that. That's great. That's where we need to be. But that's their expertise. They knew about those things. He should have asked them. And then Miss Lot. Miss Lot would have wanted number one, is do they have a Walmart? You know, that would have been the first thing that she'd have wanted to know. And then she would have wanted to know about the neighborhoods, the schools, where we're going to worship. And all that's important, very important. Because they've got a family. They've got a bunch of girls. That's the worst kind of family to have. And y'all shouldn't laugh at that. Some of those can identify with that in here, several of us. But all that information was needed in my perception of this situation. And they didn't ask for it. And it was, let's look at the next verse, verse 11. Verse 11 says, Then Lot chose for himself the plains of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east. Here it says, Lot chose for himself. So Lot had a strong attraction to this world, and he had a strong attraction to himself. Those two usually go hand in hand, and you're selfish. So had a strong attraction to himself. Now, I talked a little bit about the economic part of the decision, and I think this had a lot to do with this, because this decision would have made it easy on Lot. It would have made it a lot simpler than travels probably hundreds of miles a year up and down through these hills up around Bethel and Ai with all these herds. If he was to go down there in all this beautiful green bottomland where the water was plentiful, grass was plentiful, he wouldn't have had to travel very far, because that grass would have recovered much quicker. Sometimes in sheep and horses, you can't travel over that same area for up to a year sometimes, because the grass is all eaten down if it's an area like up in the hillsides. But in the bottomland, you may be able to do that in just a few months. And cattle, you could go back and forth across it in just a matter of weeks. So if you're able to stay within one central place and not have to travel these miles and miles and miles, that would make it possible for them to quit living in tents and live in the city. And they did. Not only that, being there with the city of the plains, having plenty of grass and plenty of water, and a much shorter grazing schedule, it also, what do they grow all these things for? Why do they have all these sheep, cattle, and goats, and camels, and what do they have them for? Commerce. They want to sell them. The cities of the plain provided a market for all these things, so he became even more wealthy. So we can see the reason he would have chose that for himself. He made that choice for himself because it was all to his advantage, that this decision was made. Now let's look at verse number 12. And Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent. My Bible says even as far as Sodom. Some of y'all may say toward Sodom. And there's where he stayed. But the men of Sodom were, in verse 13, were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. That little verse 13 would have been helpful information, I think. It doesn't say he knew it or didn't know it, but he knows it now. You know, every bad decision we make starts with one step in the wrong direction, a wrong decision. And that's no different from here. His trick to Sodom started with started with a look. You know, he looked toward Sodom, then he chose Sodom, and then he went toward Sodom. And that's the way our decisions work too. Let's read on down some more within this chapter. And the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated himself, lift up your eyes from this place, where you northward, southward, eastward, and westward, on all the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever, and I will make you descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if could not number the dust of the earth, then your descendants will also be numbered. Arise and walk through the land, through length and width that I've given you. And Abraham moved his tent and went and dwelt in the timbrous trees of Miriam, which is in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. Now let's move on down through the history here. Abraham's over here doing his thing, and we see Lot is in Sodom. And we pick up the story again in chapter number 19. Chapter 19. And here in verse 1 it says, "And two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom." Somebody tell me what it means when you get to sit in the gate of Sodom, when you get to sit in the gate. We see this term used other places in the Bible. Can somebody tell me what that term means?
You're among the elite.
Exactly. You're somebody. And Lot was somebody. He was wealthy, and he had all these herds, and he had all this stuff, and he was somebody. He may have been an elder of the city. He may have been just wealthy, but he was somebody, and he got to sit out there in the gate and be somebody, I guess you could say. And Lot saw the two men. He rose up to meet them and bowed himself to the face toward the ground. And he said, "Hear now, O lords, please turn to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go your way." And I'll paraphrase some of this. He said, "No, we're going to stay outside tonight. We're going to sleep in the square." Well, I know at this point Lot knew what kind of city he was in, because he said, "No, you can't do that. Ain't no way. You're coming home with me." And he pulled him home with him, took him home with him. And we know after they came into the home and that night they would knock on the door, and men wanted those angels to come out that they might know them. And I'm not going to go into that. You can figure that one out for yourself. And then later, and Lot offers his daughters instead. And that's number two that I didn't understand: giving your wife away and then giving your daughters away. Strange customs. Don't ask me why that occurred. I don't know. I can't imagine it. But and then the angels made them blind, and they couldn't find them. And then the next day, when God says it's time for y'all to leave, I'm going to destroy the city and everything in it, they didn't want to go. Lot and his wife and his family didn't want to leave. What are some of the reasons you think they wanted to stay there? Got comfortable there. Got accustomed to it. Sort of like the frog in boiling water, isn't it? Y'all know they turn up the heat and they just sit there. Well, they've lived there and they've got accustomed to it. And I think sometimes we're that way. You know, we used to have things on TV that, we'd hear the vile language and all, and man, turn that thing off. Well, that's before we had these to do it. We had to get up and actually push a button. But now we're so used to it, we don't even, doesn't faze us anymore. Well, that's the same situation. I'm pretty certain it would have occurred in Sodom with his family. But over in the book of 2 Peter, Peter, under inspiration, see if I can find it right quick, said something about Lot. Well, I just need one word out of there, I think. What was the word that was used to describe Lot in that verse? Righteous. So we can't beat up Lot too much, can we? Because he was a righteous man, God says, through inspiration.
Again, it seemed like to me that would be extremely difficult living in those kind of conditions, and yet the Bible still calls him a righteous man. He never let it get the best of him all together.
It said it vexed him being there. It vexed him. But he still had a hard time leaving. And I think, if he lived today, he would be a member of the Lord's church. And he would be in this situation, and maybe we're sometimes in that situation, or maybe currently in that situation. And it vexed him, is what Peter said about him. And we know that the angels had to take them by the arm and take them out. And they left their outlaws in there, and we know that they were destroyed. And he had two daughters he took out with him. And New Testament talks about Lot's wife. What happened to Lot's wife? Looked back, turned into a pillar of salt. And we know we can't look back. We don't need to, her mind was, she'd lived in Sodom, but Sodom was in her at this point. Does that make sense? And she looked back and turned into a pillar of salt. And then God destroys all that. And they go and live in a cave. And his daughters do some terrible things. I won't describe all that. You can read it for yourself. And Lot lost everything. He lost it all. Wealth, family, it's all gone. It's Lot. And that all started way back in one little simple choice. And that choice, instead of leading him to God, that choice led him away from God. I'm saying all that just to say we have to be awfully careful in our choices. There's no insignificant choices or decisions. There's not a time that you'll decide something even, we can probably all have people that grew up at Bremen that were, when they were here, I just think about two right now in my mind in the last, since I've been here. That when they was at Bremen, they was on fire. They worshiped every time. They was a part of everything. Did everything. And opportunities come that took them to other parts of the country, and you check on them, and they've fallen away. And you just can't imagine. These two people, these two families, I couldn't imagine it. They were here, they were involved in everything. In doing good and loving each other. It was just unimaginable, but it happens. Choices. We have to be so careful. And we're given a standard. I took a critical decision-making class, and one of the things I learned in that class was most of the, if not all of the standards for setting decisions were all principles found in this book. A lot of your management classes, one of the first things you'll learn in business management, you'll see the golden rule used. They don't call it that, but that's one that's used throughout. And this book gives us the criteria, the framework for making good decisions. Let me see where I got to in my notes. I'm sure I'm lost. Okay, let's turn from Lot. We've pitched enough tents. Let's turn over and look at in the book of Daniel, the other end of the Old Testament. Daniel chapter 6, and we're going to open some windows now. Daniel chapter 6, this is another story you're quite familiar with. Daniel 6. A little bit of preface before we get talking to chapter 6. Daniel was brought into captivity when he was a quite young man. At this point in chapter 6, he's 84 years old. So he's a little bit on the, he's a little older than me. And he's about as old as Chris. And now the king is Darius the Mede, and so he's out. He's not on his first king. He's been there quite a while. And let's start in verse 1, and it says, "And it pleased Darius to set over the kings 120." Mine says satraps or princesses to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one. And the princesses might give account to them, so that the king might not suffer loss. And then Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So that the governor and the princesses sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could not find no charge or fault, because he was faultless, nor was there any error in his fault found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." Now y'all can understand the situation. We see Daniel he's a foreigner and in a great position. He's just one below the king, which causes everybody else in the kingdom that has authority to be jealous, prejudice. That would happen here if that happened in America. That would be anywhere. They're prejudiced, or they have a prejudice and they're jealous of his position. And they don't like him, so they try to find something wrong with him. But this is a man of God, and we'll see that more as we go along. And they want to get rid of him. And we've in our New Testament, we find a gentleman in a similar position, and the elders and the Sadducees and Pharisees didn't like him because he gained prominence among the Jews, and they wanted to get rid of him too. A similar situation. So these men, let's read on down. So these governors and princes is thrown together before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. Now they're working on his ego a little bit here. All the governors of the kingdom and administrators and princesses and the counselors and advisors have counseled together to establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign it in writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. Okay, the king got his ego built up. He signed the decree. Now, Chad's talked about this before. King Darius was the spokesman for their god, the mouthpiece for God, and I think his name's unusual. And anything that the king said, supposedly, it was straight from the God. So that's the reason it couldn't be altered or changed or anything. And I found it interesting that they limit this to 30 days. I tried to think, why did they limit that to 30 days? Why don't they just make it forever? Then they take, if they get rid of Daniel, then anybody else that pops up, they can get rid of them too. And I think if they knew a little bit about Daniel, they said, it's not going to take long because we know this man, he's going to mess up. It won't take long because he's not going to change. And that may have been the reasoning in that. And so the king signed the decree. Verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that it was the writing was signed, he went home and he went into his upper room where his windows opened toward Jerusalem, and he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before God, as was his custom since the early days. Now he knew it was signed. He knew what the consequences of praying and getting caught was, and he did it anyway. Now there's something you need to understand about Daniel. In the first chapter of the book of Daniel, verse number 8, you remember when they were trying to get him to eat these things? Turn back over there just a second. I think we see a precedent here in Daniel. And it says, and Daniel purposed in his heart that he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Now that same, Daniel made that decision when he was a young man. There's certain things you have to decide before you ever get in that situation. You understand that? I hope you do. There's certain things you've got to decide before it faces you eyeball to eyeball, nose to nose, that I've already decided that. I know what I'm going to do in that situation. And I think Daniel had already decided years in advance that this, if anything that would, I'm more afraid of God than I am of man, in other words. We see that a lot in the New Testament, especially with the apostles as they were being persecuted. So anytime that somebody says, I'm going to do something to you, and it goes against God, well, who am I more afraid of? King Darius or God? Well, Darius can feed me to lions, and God can send me to hell. It's not a decision. I mean, it's not much of a choice if you look at it in those terms. He went home and I tried to think of all the excuses he could have used that day. He could have said, well, if I just don't pray for 30 days, then this will be over, it'll be done. Or maybe if I go in and I shut my windows and maybe I get in my closet. The New Testament talks about going to your closet and praying. If I just pray real quiet. And you could think about 100 excuses he could have probably satisfied his mind to get through this. But it says he did as he had always done, as his custom was. He went upstairs, he opened his window toward Jerusalem, and he knelt down and he prayed. I'm going to have to hurry along because I think the kids are going to catch me. Well, the fellas, all those governors came, they caught him, they turned him over to the king. The king was so upset because Daniel was one of his favorite people because Daniel was good. this king, most of these kings back then, they weren't dummies. They was extremely smart. These people that were pulled from these other countries were not brought there just for their good looks. They were brought there because they were the smartest, the brightest, and the best. And he was no exception. And being a man of God, that gave him a lot of advantages because he knew he was honest. He would always deal, correctly with the king, and he did. And so the king was upset. He tried to get figured out. He didn't figure out, how can I get out of this? And there was no way to get out of it. So when he put Daniel in the lion's den, y'all remember, he stayed up all night. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. But he told Daniel, when he put him in the lion's den, your God would deliver you. And so he knew a little bit about Daniel's God. I guess Daniel told him some things. So he had some faith in Daniel's God. And then the next morning, it said very early, not early, but very early, he went with haste to the den. And in other words, he ran. He didn't walk, he didn't jog, he ran. And he gets there and he calls out to Daniel. And Daniel's there, and Daniel tells him, let me get through where I got to. Yep. O king, and then Daniel answers him, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels to shut the lion's mouth that they should not hurt me because they have found innocent before him. O king, I have done no wrong against you. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that day that should take Daniel up from the den. So Daniel was taken up from the den, and no injury was found on him because he believed in God. And the king gave the command and brought these men who had accused Daniel and cast them into the den, and their children and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones to pieces, even before they got to the bottom. The lions were fast. And Darius wrote, to all the people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make the decree that every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. That's what happens when we make the right choice. When we walk day by day in the right direction toward God instead of away from God. You can't do that in secret. And it'll make a difference not only in your life as it did in Daniel, but in the lives of others as it did in King Darius. And that's the thing. Which direction are we going in? Are we walking to God or are we walking away from God? Are we pitching tents or are we opening windows? Thank you for your attention. Thank you.